guilty. And so if you do that, I'd sure appreciate it. And hold your side conversations down if you would too, please. With that, we've got a couple bills tonight. I'm going to be the acting chairman because Senator Steinmetz does not feel good. So we're hoping she gets better and is here tomorrow because her knowledge is sorely missed. So with that, we'll do roll call.
Senator Hicks.
Here.
Senator Ide.
Here.
Senator Kolb.
Present.
Senator French.
Here.
Chairman Steinmetz. Is it
Excused.
excused?
All right, with that, first up is House Bill 17. And with that, we went through this a couple weeks ago and decided to hold it over till this time. So if there's any agency people that would like to come up. Excuse me here a second. See, I told you Senator Steinmetz was more organized than me. Okay. House Bill 17, state lands grazing of non-owned livestock. So this is kind of a big deal here. I'd ask a SLIB agency, the director, what's the current situation with respect to lessees having a state grazing lease and not owning the livestock that's on that lease? Can you expand on that a little bit, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason Crowder, Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. The current situation or the current interpretation of the statute and practice on the ground is that the lease approved by the Board of Land Commissioners for grazing agriculture purpose goes to a lessee. And the expectation is that lessee manages and runs grazing operations or agriculture operations on that lease. The expectation over time, or again, the interpretation over time, is that he also owns that livestock that he manages on the land. And if he doesn't, then we would require a sublease agreement be approved by the office. And if there is an excess payment inside of the agreement between the two parties, half of that excess payment is owed back to the state as the existing statute requires. That's how it's currently done on state trust lands.
So if I have a lease and I have a 10-year grazing lease and I don't have my own cattle on that lease, as long as I'm making that yearly payment or subleasing it, I'm fine to retain that lease. Is that correct? Is that how that goes?
Mr. Chairman, if you have a sublease for the livestock you don't own, you are fine, yes.
If that's the key,
Yeah.
if I have a sublease.
Correct.
Okay, all right. Any questions of the slip? Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, acting chairman, or co-chairman. General question, how do you know how much the sublease amount may be, for half of it being owed back? How would you know about that transaction? I mean, what's the requirements for notification? Could you please help me with that? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, we have to rely on the lessees to report that to us. So we obtain the information from them when they file for the sublease and would disclose the amounts, any excess rental they are receiving at that point, and half of that would then be due to the trust beneficiaries. If you need to add on, feel free.
Senator Hicks.
Director, could you just walk me through how excess rental is determined? What factors go into that, making that
Reporting
determination?
the amount that they're getting, right? Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, it's my understanding that whatever amount is reported by the lessee as with respect to what they're receiving from the sublessee to run the cattle, then it's half of whatever that excess rental is on that goes to the agency. And I don't know, Jason, if you have more detail on the process than I do, since I'm not in the middle of it, but.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, some of these agreements can get to be rather complex, especially how fencing and water and other improvements lie in just general land ownership. So as the director mentioned, we ask for the agreement if we can get it. If not, we have a form on our website that they can fill out that asks certain questions that kind of fill in that complexity gap a little bit. It's sometimes extremely difficult to determine how much usage of that sublease agreement is attributable to the state land involved in the agreement, and sometimes it's really simple. But we have staff that have done this for quite some time, and they understand the questions to ask and what attributes to look for to determine what that fair amount is. And it's not a direct science, I will say. Sometimes it's a little bit of an art because you have timing constraints that are put in there. We have an annual or a year-long lease with a specific amount of forage available through the AUM assessment on an annual basis. And sometimes these are just weeks or month type agreements that we're looking at. So we have to put that timing in there as well. And depending on where those improvements lie, they may heavily utilize the state land or they may just look at it. And so we need to work cooperatively with the grazing lessees and with the sublessees to really understand how the property is being used inside that agreement. All of that thrown into the pot comes up with a number. Is it the perfect number every time? Probably not. And sometimes we miss it. And sometimes the lessees and sublessees question us on the number. And we're happy to talk with them to say, enlighten us a little bit more and tell us where we're missing it. And we'll come to a better figure to pull that half excess rental from.
Further questions of the agency. Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just on page 2, lines 13, 14, on the proposed change, the wording "not be required to obtain approval," is that going to make it more difficult for you to understand what's going on the land when it comes to ascertaining the rental amounts? Is that going to be a more of a challenge to currently? I guess you're relying on people. What's your opinion about what that change means? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, we do have concerns about the non-approval, if you will, of the director and the non-notification to the board. As you know, and we've testified several times, the board and the office have a fiduciary duty to the trust beneficiaries. And as part of that, even on lines 8 and 9 on page 2, it says that we have to make sure that these agreements inure to the benefit of the trust beneficiaries. And it's a little difficult for us to ascertain that if we don't know what's going on out there. So we believe that the office and the board are entitled to know what's going out there and to make sure that everything is on the up and up and inures to the greatest interest of the trust beneficiaries. And so, and then the other issue that we have that we're concerned about is exactly the understanding of the financial transaction that's going on out there. It's unclear to us the way this bill is written, whether or not it's designed to get around that 1/2 of the excess rental. It's unclear if that would still be paid or not. Again, any agreements have to inure to the benefit of the trust beneficiaries. And so allowing a grazing lessee to essentially earn a profit off the trust asset, we think that would be a problem. And as with the fiduciary duty, it's a problem for us to allow that to go on. Again, the arrangement has to inure to their benefit. So if they're not getting paid in some way for that benefit, that's a problem. And Mr. Chairman, Deputy Director Crowder has brought a PowerPoint that should be in your materials to kind of talk you through some of the financial piece of this with respect to the rental that we charge the grazing lessee and sort of how these third-party arrangements can impact what the trust beneficiaries are getting and the benefit that's going to the existing grazing lessee. So with that, with your permission, I would turn it over to Deputy Director Crowder to go through that PowerPoint.
Thank you. Are we talking this here?
Yes.
Okay, everybody got this? All right, if you'd walk us through it, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It struck us as we were working the bill that the committee is relatively new, and we haven't had the opportunity to explain the grazing fee formula to you. We've done that to the Joint Ag Committee several times in the past, but not recently. So we wanted to ensure that you understood the roots of the grazing fee formula, what the legislature has done, what the board has done, and the impacts that it might have, if you think there are any, to this bill from that effort. So on slide number 2, 365101 gives a framework for how the grazing fee is to be derived. This is legislative guidance to the Board of Land Commissioners, and it required certain criteria be followed when the board set a formula to come up with the fee. Number 1 is that it had to be readily available data averaged over an adequate number of years to remove any radical fluctuations. Number 2, it had to include factors which reasonably reflect the true market value of a state lease. Number 3 is it had to have parameters within which the board can be responsive to changing resource conditions, market demand, and industry viability. And I'm going to hit this industry viability part a couple times in this presentation. And then number 4, factors which reasonably reflect the contributions made by the lessee. So then, Mr. Chairman, on slide number 3, the board did determine a formula that met all of that criteria, and it put it within its within its rules and regulations. And this is the formula we use each year to determine that year's grazing fee. What they did was they rooted the fee in the private land lease rate. That lease rate is provided by the National Agricultural Statistics Service because the Wyoming Agricultural Statistics Service does not exist. So we use NASS, and they look at Wyoming data for us. They determine what that private land lease rate is on an annual basis, and then they average it for us over the preceding 5 years. Then they also provide us with a parity ratio, and the board has determined that that parity ratio covers a lot of the boxes required by the legislature, specifically changes in resource conditions, market demand, and again, the resource or the industry viability. And that is intended to create a situation that allows a sustainability factor, and we'll get to that in a minute, but a sustainability factor for the industry operating on state lands. And then they utilize 20% as another deduction to reflect the lessee's contributions made to the lease. So when they go out and they check fence, they check water, they have to deal with the public on publicly accessible lands. They have to negotiate on the state's behalf for secondary uses that come on the property like oil and gas. So they needed to give the lessee a credit for that type of work when they do it on behalf of the state, and they determined that to be 20%. Slide 4, Mr. Chairman, is how that happened in 2023. So as I mentioned, NASS provided all of this information for us. They determined the private land lease rate averaged over 5 years was $20.41. And this is on an AUM basis, so that's $20.41 per AUM. They determined that the 5-year weighted average of the parity ratio was 0.33, and then we have the standard deduction of 20%. So how that works in the formula is you start with your foundational private land lease rate, and then you reduce it by that parity ratio. So there's a 66% reduction at that point. And then you further reduce it for the lessee's contribution to the lease by 20%, which comes up with what we are charging in 2023 of $5.39 in AUM. The important part of this formula, especially when we're discussing who's paying it and who's benefiting from it, is that parity ratio, because it does cover such a broad array of items that the legislature required attention be paid to. And it is the part that covers the industry viability piece. So we wanted to dig in a little bit on that. The definition as provided by NASS of the parity ratio is it's the measurement of the purchasing power of the products sold by farmers in terms of things they buy compared with their purchasing power in the base period of 1910 to 1914. Obviously, things are a little bit more expensive today than they were back then. So this number has been adjusted for inflation to try to create an apples to apples scenario. But this parity ratio is something that NASS provides not only to us, but the federal government as well when it's working on subsidy programs, when it's determining its AUM fee as well. But there needed to be some ratio and some base period to determine how is the economy of the agriculture product industry doing compared to that base period, and they picked 1910 to 1914. So in other words, how much does it cost to produce 100 pounds of beef cattle weighted over the previous 5 years using that baseline? So it's important to note that this deduction is separate from the lessee's contributions to the lease. This is specifically to the ag operation on that lease, trying to ensure there is sustainability or some industry viability for that producer who is on that lease. It's essentially a risk coverage. The state is assuming the risk of a poor market. Should the lessee not be able to sell whatever product he produces off of state land at a rate that could create a profit or at least break even, the state's assumed the responsibility or the risk of allowing him to at least cover the costs for the amount of his operation that's on state land. That's the best interpretation we can have based on the statute that's provided and what the Board of Land Commissioners has done. And it's an important distinction, and so I want to make it again. It is just to the product developed off of the land and not their contributions to the lease. So it's simply assuming the risk of the cost to produce that product. When we bring it to this bill, when a third party enters the equation and utilizes the property, and to your point of do they need to own the livestock or not, that risk is mitigated for the lessee. The risk is then covered by the third-party owner of the livestock because he's the one producing that livestock. We don't know if the legislative intent was to further that risk balance from just the lessee onto third-party users or third-party owners of the livestock that may be utilizing that forage. And so the agreement between those two is simply an agreement that compensates the lessee for the livestock and the use of the forage. He's assuming the risk of the cost to produce that beef. So we don't know if that was the intent and if the parity ratio is still appropriate at that time. And if it is, then perhaps it needs to assuredly be transferred to that third-party owner and no longer rest with the lessee, which could be a different formula for the board and the legislature to contemplate going forward. Page 8, Mr. Chairman, is just simply how the process works today in real numbers. When we have a sublease situation, we assess the 50% excess fee as required by statute. You can see that the 2023 grazing fee is $5.39. When we did a review of the average subleases in the office, they came back at charging $15 to $30 in AUM. And that's to the point that Senator Hicks made earlier. That's when we need to get into those private agreements and make sure that that's the amount that's attributable to the lease that they're using and not just the surrounding lands. But that's the average attributable amount to the usage of state lands. What that means is the excess rental, or the difference between the two amounts, is anywhere from $9.61 to $24.61 per AUM. The 50% assessment that we charge at that point is anywhere from $4.81 to $12.31 per AUM, meaning the total rental is the $10.20 to $17.70 per AUM. And as I mentioned earlier, the parity ratio may not be appropriate in the sense of a third-party owner running livestock on state lands. And so to provide you with just real numbers, if we were to remove that parity ratio and because the risk is being handled by a different party than the lessee, the rate would just be reduced by the lessee's contributions to the lease because he is still retaining management authority. He's still out there checking fences. He's still handling all of the regular state lease management in problems, if you will, or things that are different from a private lease. And so that rate would be $16.33 per AUM. And as the director mentioned, the bill is a little unclear, but we believe that these types of agreements would not be subject to the 50% excess rate, which means just on page 9, the total rental would remain at the minimum, which is $5.39 per AUM. As the director mentioned, we have a fiduciary responsibility, and we take that very seriously, and that's why we charge rent on the uses of state land. And so we, on average, approve or review 400 subleases each year. That means 10% of the leases out there are being subleased in some manner. And I don't know that, fairly confident, I guess, that we don't know all of the subleases that are out there. This is very much a self-reporting situation, as the director mentioned. And so we're probably not knowing all of them that are out there. And that of all of the subleases that come into the office, that's about $1 million revenue stream on an annual basis. It's important to note that grazing as a whole, from all aspects of it, creates a $6.3 million revenue stream on an annual basis. So subleasing in whole is 16% of that revenue stream from grazing and agricultural leases. Mr. Chairman, that is the background of grazing and the grazing fees and subleasing, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks. That was very educational. Just one question, and then we'll go to the committee questions. Who determines when the lease, because the state varies so much, who determines that, okay, this chunk of state land that's up for lease has 100 AUMs or 50 AUMs or whatever? Who determines that? Says this parcel that you're wanting to lease, there's 100 AUMs, you can put 100 AUMs out. How's that determined?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. It is a very enviable group of people that I used to be a part of, and I'm no longer. But we have field staff scattered across the state. We have 5 of them. They have range management backgrounds to varying degrees, and what we give them is a method called the ocular reconnaissance method, where they go out and determine the available forage on each parcel, on each lease, and they do an AUM or a carrying capacity assessment on each lease. And so it's folks that have a good educational background in the subject matter and giving them a good method that can be used consistently across and in an consistently across the state and in a somewhat efficient manner. Understanding that we have 4,000 leases and 5 individuals, then we have to hit a bunch of them very quickly. So that AUM figure may not be perfect. And it's also not expected to be the exact number each year. Obviously, we have good wet years, we have dry years, a bunch of different factors roll into it. So if individuals use 110 AUMs one year or 90 the next, we're not going to be out there policing it, but that's how it's determined.
Senator Ide?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crowder, thank you for being here. And I have 2 questions. I want you to go over those last stats that you gave, but the other question is, can those AUMs be contested by the lessee, essentially? Say that somebody comes out, he's had it for 10 years. After 10 years, they come back and say, your AUMs are going down by 20%. And can that lessee, what's his role to argue that, and how successful can he be when that happens? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, to answer your last question first, very much so. So we're not going to be able to look at each and every lease every year or even once during the term of the lease. So if there is something that's askew in the lessee's mind, they can absolutely call and make a request, and we'll repurpose some field staff from where they were headed to try to get over there in a timely manner and do a new assessment of that. And that happens very regularly. To answer your first question second, did you want me to restate the number of subleases? And
Mr. Chair, you kind of hit on the percentage of the leases that are subleases, and then you gave the dollar amount of what that is. It was like 16%. I wasn't writing it down fast enough because those were good statistics. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, your memory is good. Yes, so roughly 400 subleases are reviewed and approved each year. Those generate approximately $1 million a year, and that is 16% of the total revenue derived from the agriculture and grazing program.
And what was you gave a total of 6.3 million, I think.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Co-Chairman French. Just a couple questions. Do some leaseholders stay away from subleasing for fear of making a mistake and losing a lease? Neither state beneficiary or landowner makes money if they don't take that risk.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, perhaps, and I guess I don't know what each individual lessee would be thinking when approached with that situation. What I will tell you is that the statute says the leases are subject to cancellation if the agreements are not approved. So we do whatever we can to get the agreements approved. When we understand that situation exists, we say, you need to get a sublease approved, either give us the agreement or fill out the form that's on our website, and we'll work it through the process. The point in time where it really becomes problematic, because I don't think we've ever canceled a lease in the middle of a term because of a sublease scenario, is when the lease is up for renewal, it's at its expiration date, and we have a conflicting application against it. The statute, 365105, provides that the existing lessee has a preferred right to renew by meeting a high bid if he is compliant with the rules and regulations of the board and the statutes and the terms of the lease. If they don't have an approved sublease, they're not compliant with that, and then they're not afforded the preferred right to renew. So if the lessee feels that that is a big enough risk to not enter into a sublease, I could see where they would be coming from, but I also see your point. We believe the process for which subleases are managed now, where the state takes half, the lessee gets to keep half of that excess rental, it's still a money-making venture, and so they would have to weigh both sides of that.
Thank you.
Further questions? Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One more statistic I want to get out of you. I think it's some testimony you guys had earlier this week in committee. There's a total of around 4,000 leases, 400 a year turnover. What's the total, acreage amount, so to speak, on the 4,000 leases? Do you know? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, I don't know that exact number. What we do know is that roughly 98% of the land that the state owns is under a grazing lease. The surface ownership is 3.4 million acres. So I can pull out my calculator to do that math for you, but it's roughly 98% of the 3.4 million.
Further questions from the committee? Stay close by, if you would, please. Is there any other agencies? Seeing none, public comment? Mr. McGagnon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association, also on behalf of the Wyoming Wool Growers Association. To clarify this a little bit, I'd like to set out two very different scenarios. If I choose to lease my ranch out to someone to run their livestock and sublease my state leases along with that, that's very clear. I'm getting paid so much an AUM or perhaps per acre, but most often an AUM to do that. It's a very easy calculation. I've subleased my land, so of the AUMs I got, if 20% of the AUMs are on the state land, calculate how much I owe under the current statutory requirements. But the other scenario, the one we're attempting to address here, is I bring in someone else's livestock to operate, and I'm totally operating them. I'm responsible for them. I may have a lease that says I'm getting $30 an AUM, or not a lease. It's not a lease. It's an agreement for $30. As a part of that, I may be providing the daily care of the livestock. I'm putting out the supplements that the livestock need. I'm taking care of the veterinary needs of the livestock if any of them are sick. I'm gathering them. I'm moving them from pasture to pasture. I'm doing everything associated with those livestock. So to take that and say that to calculate how much of what I'm receiving is the payment for the forage that then, assuming that the livestock spend X amount of time on the state land that I then divide with the state, is almost an impossible thing. It's very arbitrary. It's very challenging to people, and they constantly, it's not that they're complaining about paying so much as they're complaining about the steps they have to go through in those type of scenarios. And today, more than perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago, more people are running livestock that they don't own for a couple of reasons. One is that in a lot of areas of the state, it's become very popular to summer yearling cattle, for example. Rather than have a cow-calf herd, and then you have to put up hay and you have to feed them all winter, you can bring in yearlings for the summer, graze your meadows rather than haying them or after you hay them, and you manage just their operation just like you always did, except that you don't own the animals that are out there. Another scenario is drought situation, which we've experienced, and people have sold off part of their cow herds simply because they didn't have the forage. And now say we get a wet year like this, there may be extra forage this summer, and you can't rebuild your cow herd in one summer because you have breeding and that you want to use, so you bring in some other animals to complement your herd for few years until you could rebuild your own herd. So there are many of those scenarios. What we're attempting to address with this legislation, which we brought forward to the Joint Ag Committee during the interim, is to say that in those cases where the only difference out there is that basically that the livestock don't all have my brand on them, but I'm doing everything the same as I would do it if they were my livestock, that does not meet the definition of a sublease by any legal standard that I'm aware of. And it needs to be recognized and dealt with in a different manner. So we're saying if you have that type of a scenario where you maintain management control, then it shouldn't be any different than if you're running your own livestock. The issue is brought up about the risk involved. Well, yes, if I'm running my livestock, I'm taking a risk based on the market. But if I'm running someone else's livestock, what they're willing to pay me to run those livestock is based on their analysis of the risk they're facing. So the risk doesn't disappear just because I'm not running my own livestock. It's reflected in what I can receive for running someone else's livestock. So what we've attempted to do here is to address that scenario and say that's not a lease. We believe in the language that's in the bill. It's very clear. The final part beginning on line 16, 17, 18, page 2 says that if you do that and you have management responsibility, such use of state land shall not be considered a sublease. So I don't see where there's any doubt then whether or not you split a fee, because the current statutory language says that if you sublease, you pay 1/2 of the excess rental to the state. If, as we've defined here, this is not a sublease, you're not paying 1/2 of this excess rental to the state. Now, I have proposed for you an amendment, and it's not the one from last week. It's a new one that was passed out today that we've been working on. And it attempts to address some of the concerns that maybe have been expressed with regards to the bill the way it is. First of all, it authorizes the Board of Land Commissioners to develop some regulations to clearly define what constitutes full management responsibility, because that's a term that could be subject to interpretation. So it would allow the board to through a rulemaking process, define that. The second thing it does, recognizing that there is some concern about revenues, although we believe that this will not result in diminishment of revenues, but we've also proposed to authorize the board to set an across-the-board fee for operating non-owned livestock. So rather than going through this complicated process of calculation, which is going to mean always going to be arguable whether you calculated it right with all of those other factors, that the board could establish a fee or fees that say, if you run non-owned livestock, you pay X amount in addition to your annual rental based on the number of head of non-owned livestock. And then the third element to that amendment is not to say that you need approval, because it's our position you don't need approval to run non-owned livestock as long as you haven't subleased, but you would have a reporting requirement the board could establish so that the land office is aware of the fact that you're doing this and how many head of non-owned livestock you're running on the lease, just for informational purposes, to keep that as public information. With that, Mr. Chairman, I've tried to explain the reason why we think this is critical. We've had a lot of pressure from across the state, from our membership and others, saying the process as it is now just doesn't work. It's assuming something is a sublease when it's far from being a sublease. And with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions the committee may have.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. McGagnon. I have a question for you. At what point, how do I say this? At what point is a leasee just holding on to that state land to potentially make his ranch more valuable? You know, maybe they're getting ready to sell it and they have 10,000 acres and 4,000 of it's state lease. You know, that's a valuable thing in a sale of a ranch. So at what point, do you see a point where, God, this person hasn't been grazing on his own ranch for a long, long time, and he's controlling these state leases? Do you see a point where that somebody needs to question that?
Mr. Chairman, I think those circumstances can exist, and that takes me back to other language that has been in statutes since 1997 and was strengthened by a bill that you've already passed this session, which says that you have to have necessary use for the lease. So if someone is just holding a state lease just because, gee, I like having this land in my possession and I'm not using it as part of a grazing operation, then I think that language exists in statute, addresses that. Now, if they're maintaining a working ranch but just happen to be grazing livestock that they don't own, then our position would be that that's still consistent with a grazing lease on the land. It's being grazed. It's keeping the integrity of the ranch together. If a state lease is so critical to an operation, if it is a significant part of it, and the loss of that state lease destroys the economic viability of the ranch and causes that ranch to be sold to to be subdivided or to be sold to someone who just wants to own it for pleasure purposes and not use it for livestock grazing at all, then that has a negative impact, we believe, certainly on our industry, but even on the state of Wyoming and our open spaces and our wildlife habitat. So as long as the land is being grazed in an appropriate manner, then we don't see it as inappropriate that the owner of the ranch is not necessarily running their own livestock. If they're still engaged in the ranching operation, they're running these livestock. They're not just leasing the ranch out to someone. They're running the livestock.
Okay. Any questions for the Stock Growers Association? Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, Jim, so when we get down to the new language there, starting on line 50, it says the leasee retains full management responsibility. So what kind of arrangement do you see that they notify the Office of State Lands and Investment of that arrangement? What is the compliance or the acknowledgement? I know it talks about back up here with some of the proposed language that the director would approve assignment of these subleases and contract. But you talked something about rulemaking, but I don't find anything about rulemaking in here on how they would go about doing that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, if you look at the amendment that I passed out today, that's where we attempt to address that there has to be that the board would adopt rules requiring notification, defining what constitutes full management responsibility, and providing a process for notification.
So, Mr. Chairman, Jim, I'm not so sure because we've got one proposed amendment up here. Which amendment are you talking about?
It's an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I had passed out an amendment last week, and I today advised the staff to remove that amendment. And the new one today adds an additional provision with regards to the establishment of a flat fee for running non-owned livestock.
Are we getting rid of this?
Well,
It's in our book.
Mr. Chairman, that's the one I'm trying to figure out where that is because I'm not so sure which one it is. We have House Bill 17, Amendment Number 2. It says the State Land Board Commission is authorized to promulgate rules defining full management.
That's the one, Mr. Chairman.
That's the
Senator
new
Hicks.
one?
Yes.
All right.
Further questions of Stockgrowers Association? Seeing none, stick around.
Thank you, Mr.
Other
Chairman.
public comment? Mr. Moline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Committee, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. When I was a county extension agent, one of the hardest questions I had to try to answer is, what is a grazing lease worth? Because of all the different scenarios, who supplies what. I do appreciate the amendment that would give the State Lands Board, the State Board of Land Commissioners, the ability to define what full management responsibility is. And I'm working a scenario through my mind that, and I'll use my family as an example. If we had a school section, we've got the Ex Hart Ranch Corporation, then the person that manages that corporation, my brother David Moline, runs livestock too. We don't pay him a wage, he runs the livestock. If we would have a school section, I don't think that would qualify as a sublease because it's all being ran as one operation. There's not a true distinction between who owns what. But I think giving this, there's so much gray area in trying to define, having this in statutes. That's why I appreciate being able to have the ability to define what full management responsibility is. And I'm wondering if we do, this just pops into my head, so I haven't discussed it with Mr. McGagna, but do we need to have a definition in there of what subleasing is? And I'm kind of leaning towards not having that definition. I think the full management responsibilities would help answer this question. If you have full management responsibility, it's not subleasing. And so then it's going to be very critical how you define full management responsibility. If it's grazing the animals for, if you have the decisions for reproduction, for sales, et cetera. So sitting in somewhat support of the bill and the amendment, I know I'm straddling the fence awful hard here, Mr. Chairman. With that, I would take any questions you or the committee may
You
have.
did just fine. Any questions of Mr. Moline? Any questions?
Thank you.
Stick around, please. Is there any other public comment? Please come up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Committee. My name is Marguerite Herman, and I'm sitting here as a member, actually a board member of a group called Advocates for School Trust Lands. And they are concerned with management of the trust assets, including the lands and the minerals, and also the trust funds in the various states that still have a substantial number of the original acres given to them at statehood. So the Western United States, basically. And so actually, this was kind of an interesting lesson in how grazing rates are even discussed. And what occurs to me is that, and I agree with people who say, definitions are difficult and complicated, but very necessary. And I guess what has occurred to me, doing some listening and looking into this, is that it's not a matter of issue of who controls the cattle that is using trust lands, but it's a matter of ownership. That's where that initial parity adjustment is made. It's 0.33 times something, and it's the risk, the market risk of the entity, the lessee who owns the cattle. Assuming that the cattle that is then being fed on forage goes to market, and it so reflects that risk. And so maybe this is not, it occurs to me, this is not really a subleasing, but it's whether you are entitled to the initial discount of that market risk, because if it's not, it's a matter of ownership, I guess, rather than control. And I'd have to agree with that. And so that calculation on the very last part of that PDF handout, where what happens when you remove that initial discount, the 0.33, is then that is the lease rate to the person who's leasing, and then whatever agreement this person has with a third party, I guess, is a separate thing. And I certainly do not dispute anything the legislature has decided about what factors into a lease, but I would just say the ownership and the ultimate sale, productivity, profits to the owner. That becomes sort of the factor in setting these leases. And it just occurs to me, and with trepidation, I suggest that maybe subleasing is not the issue here, but it's setting of the lease, what deductions is a person entitled to that applies to the situation. And maybe this is a subject for maybe an interim topic for joint ag, dig down into that. Again, it's been said by various people, the point of this land, the point of trust assets of any kind, is to produce revenue for the beneficiaries. That's why we got the land in the first place. It's statehood. It's stated in our Act of Admission, stated in our Constitution, and we all acknowledge that. And so in furtherance of that, I would say, this is something that should be probably worked out rather than, at 5:30 p.m. In this committee. But I just would say what has occurred to me is that we've all been talking around who controls and who manages, and it's really about the ownership, the ultimate person who will take the cattle to market. The market risk, that parity is based on that, and so that doesn't seem to apply to the lessee, the person who has signed the lease with the OSLI and the Board of Land Commissioners. That's my comments. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer it. I'm just becoming familiar with this formula myself.
Right, well, thank you for your comments. I would just say that the SLIB board is doing their darndest to juggle this thing and make as much money as possible for the beneficiaries. They have a lot on their plate. They're trying to, in their way, look out for the ranchers and farmers, whoever's leasing these leases. The legislature, we're doing our best too to get it right. We want to get it right. Is it all perfect? No. But we're doing our darndest, and they're doing their darndest to
Mr. Chairman,
make it work.
I would agree that we're all headed toward the same point, and defining relationships, what is use, what is not use, what is ownership, how the formula is generated, how it gets applied. So seeing as we all agree on the outcome, that's actually 90% of the situation,
battle,
and it's good. And I do appreciate the effort of the land commissioners, OSLI, and the legislature. We all agree on that, but how we get there, I think, is probably worth a little digging into.
Yeah, I would agree. There's nothing wrong with always reviewing these formulas and how this is done. Any questions? It was Marguerite, correct?
Correct.
Senator Hicks?
Yeah, Marguerite, have you had a chance to review the amendment proposed by Mr. McGagnon?
No, Mr. Chairman, no, I have not. But, I'm sorry, excuse me, just the idea of a flat fee, oh, thank you. I would just, I would say that, let's, once again, maybe this could be, a minor topic for an interim and do the math and see how the numbers work out, and does it seem to reflect the actual value of what's being used, and returning a fair value to the beneficiaries. But a flat fee would, but once again, in lieu of the parity, the market parity adjustment, I would assume. Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you'll look at that, I think that will address part of your concerns, which were part of my concerns. We can't pass a law that then violates the fiduciary responsibility of the SLIB board to generate the maximum level of returns. This amendment, I think the way it's structured and some of the other stuff will start to address that it will have to go through the rulemaking process, but it also would require or could require an additional surcharge for those non-owned livestock. So I think that gets to your concern is we don't want to lose revenue if we're still running the same number of livestock. It's a matter of ownership and profit. So I would take a look at that, but I think that addresses, I think my concern and your concern was the fiduciary responsibility for what these lands exist for.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think what this does is it adds yet another factor into that 3 point. Now we have a fourth factor that is a calculation that we don't know how it's figured out. And I guess I would just be reluctant to, assuming, of course, rulemaking expertise of the executive branch. Nevertheless, I would suggest that this is probably worth looking at, seeing how it shakes out. Does it fully represent the use of the forage and the compensation to the trust? It's probably worth looking at with a little more time.
Marguerite, I would say to you, the director and deputy director are right here, they're listening to what you're saying. So in their spare time, they can
Sure.
look at this. But thank you for any other questions of Marguerite? Seeing none, thank you for your comments. Any other comments from the public? Going once, going twice. Anybody online? Nobody online. Okay. Public discussion is over. I'm going to have to get help, phone a friend from Senator Hicks, because we've got a number of amendments that we have to go through. Do have copies of the big, the one I handed you earlier, the 10-pager or whatever?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I've got a question if I could have the agency come back up. Yeah, I think we have those. Yeah, right there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I stole yours. Yeah, what's it? So when we look at this, either one of these has an effective date of July 23rd. And the question is, when do the leases, they're 10-year leases. And so most of by July 1st, not always, but a lot of the livestock are out on the lease. And I'm just wondering about the time frame, given all the other responsibilities that we've saddled you guys with. If this goes into effect by July 1st of 2023, those lessees have already paid that lease agreement for the 2023 grazing season. Is that correct? So it wouldn't affect them even if it was adopted July 1st of 2023, because their payments still had to be in the Office of State Land and Investment by that time. So if we move that back to reflect more of the annual grazing season and the payment schedule, what date would that be?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, we would think an effective date of December 31st would be sufficient.
All right, Mr. Chairman, that was my question.
Of this year? December 31st of this year.
Mr. Chairman, correct.
I just want to make sure I get this right. Okay, Senator Ide, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just get my statistics right here again so I know what I'm doing. So that $1 million that you guys collect in sublease revenue, that doesn't have anything to do with receiving one half in addition to what the sublease is. Yeah, let me kind of restate that. Are you currently collecting anything more? Like if there is a sublease and it's for 50% more than what the underlying lessee is paying, you guys aren't collecting any on that currently, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, we are. So anything above what the lessee is paying the state for that minimum fee, anything above the $5.39, we will assess a 50% excess rental fee on that. So it doesn't matter how much it is above. As long as it is above, we'll take half. If it's $1, we'll take 50 cents. If it's whatever. The $1 million is that half excess rental.
Okay, that's what I wanted to get to. Exactly. Thank you. Yep.
Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just to try to rephrase a question. You have a person who has a very large parcel of property and there's a small section on there, or piece that you have authority over, for leasing. Do you think there's an issue with, I guess, your decisions on that small parcel on how a property owner with a much, larger parcel would conduct their business? Do you see a negative impact there for your choices with their business decisions on a large parcel? If I phrase that correctly, so I can understand it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kolb, I don't think so. And we run into this situation a lot. So we have to, I have a couple points here for you. We have to base the rent in something foundational. That foundational piece is the AUM, how much forage is available, which makes the value of that lease. And that's where this whole thing comes up. Actual necessary use is a requirement to hold the lease, but that doesn't mean you use it every year. So when you're managing a large block of land, like you're saying, you may not hit that piece of state land, but you still need to pay rent for it. In order to maintain control of that lease, you still need to pay something for that. So that's why the AUM component creates that foundational layer, and you get to maintain the lease for the term of the lease. How you manage the rest of your land doesn't much affect the state land or our management of it when you think about it from that context. I also think when we're contemplating this bill in that scenario and the amendment that Mr. Magagna brought, defining full management authority or full management responsibility is an important thing to do. But what is also important likely is for the board to define what, let me find the exact language, what is livestock that the lessee does not own? Because it's a fair assessment to say there are a lot of management scenarios, especially on a larger ranch, that may not be specific to lessee equals owned livestock. There could be some scenario where more livestock are on that ranch than what that particular lessee happens to own. And so if the board had some discretion to determine what is normal in an operation or what is helping a familial relationship or trying to grow that business operation and create more of a sustainability factor, we could do that. Or what tips the scales into a commercial venture? What is a situation like the director mentioned? You are starting now to create a revenue stream from the state lease where you're taking it away from the beneficiaries. If the board had the discretion to create rules around that definition as well, you could handle a much larger land block management philosophy when we're just a little part of it.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you. Okay, board, we've got what have we got here? 3 amendments, is that correct? phone a friend. Steinmetz Amendment 1, the real short one. And then Steinmetz Amendment number 2. And then Mr. Gagner's amendment. So are there any other amendments, committee? Hearing none, I guess we'll go with Steinmetz number 1 amendment. And all it does on page 1, line 3, delete and.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to make a recommendation for the committee, because if we look at the other proposed amendment, Senator Steinmetz, we're running into the same situation, that this is obviously more of an archaic statute that was promulgated. It's the style, it's a paragraph. And that we take this information and we would incorporate Mr. McGagn's suggestions, and we have 2 of them here. A lot of this is formatting that Senator Steinmetz has provided from LSO. And we get this incorporated into one piece of legislation, and we bring that back as a substitute bill and get that out for the committee to look at. Because we currently have 3 amendments now that are proposed to the bill. And then one other suggestion from the Office of State Land, actually 2 of them that I think that we would want to incorporate. My concern is because of the larger amendment that was handed out earlier, really gets to the formatting issue that we dealt with on the last bill. I think it'll make this much clearer, much cleaner than trying to work all of these 3 different amendments into the bill. Secretary has something.
Senator.
I just wanted to remind you, there was another recommended amendment on the effective date, correct?
December 31st,
Right.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So,
But that wasn't voted on?
yeah, no, and we're just
Okay.
going through, so that's.
Because they have 4 amendments.
That's
Is there-
4 amendments, and then I have another suggestion as a result of, for the rulemaking to also maybe look at what constitutes a livestock leasee that does not own, I think is commented on. I want to look at that as part of that rulemaking. So, Mr. Chairman, we could have potentially up to 5 different amendments in this bill, and a lot of it's just structure. That I think we'd be better served, and the public would be better served if we just lay this back for now, get a substitute bill drafted up, and bring that back at our Tuesday meeting.
Senator Hicks, do we need to, and I'm good with that, that's probably a good idea. Do we need to read all these amendments in and vote on them before we lay it back to incorporate it into a substitute bill, I guess?
Mr. Chairman, I think if we provide LSO and staff that direction, that's well within our normal process. To say, we don't need to adopt them at this point in time. We direct them to go ahead and incorporate all of this into a substitute bill, and then when we come back, we'll work the substitute. At that point in time, we will delete, and basically it'll have all the amendments in it,
In the bill.
in the bill. And at that point in time, then we can work that bill and figure out whether we want to adopt all of them or not.
Okay, is the committee good with that?
I second that motion.
So those in favor of that,
Just laying the bill back
laying the bill back?
until Tuesday, and then we'll, Mr. Chairman, will just authorize staff. You've got the 4 proposed amendments. Do we have those down? And get those back to LSO and have them draft that up. I want to explore the other one that Office of State Lands Director suggested, or Deputy Director Crowder did. Look at defining a definition of that as part of the rulemaking. But I'll work on that and get that to LSO. But, Mr. Chairman, I think that'll have a much more cohesive bill for everybody to look at, because I don't know that we can actually work these amendments in and I'm just tracking all of them in, and there's some overlapping issues that we need to address.
I would agree. Any other comments? All right, those in favor of that motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Chair votes aye too. Well, thanks, everybody. We'll, next week, we'll have this thing perfect or close to it. We won't take comment from Mr. Moline or. There you go. So next up for your consideration is House Joint Resolution Number 3. Representative Winter, would you please come up? When you're ready, take it away.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is John Winter. I'm the representative for House District 28, and I bring to you House Joint Resolution Number 3, Wild Horses and Burros Best Management Practices. The purpose of this resolution is to get the attention of our Congress to make some changes to the Wild Horse and Burro Act of 1971. The BLM and Forest Service are tasked with the proper management of these animals on federal land with the concept of multiple use with other recognized resources found there, which include such resources as other wildlife, recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, natural, scenic, scientific, and historical values. These requirements for management are mandated by FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, and wild horses are technically feral, although because they have no natural predators and can double in population in 4 to 5 years, where they're located, the range resource is very fragile, and most of these horses are in the state of Wyoming are found in that region. If we don't reduce these numbers, the range resource is going to be destroyed for good. Horses are a dominant species, and they control the water sources and dominate what range is available. The location of the horses in Wyoming is primarily in the southwest portion of Wyoming, what is generally referred to as the checkerboard, wherein every other section is private land. These private land owners have been very tolerant with these horses. But however, all they can do is complain to the management agency and hope something good might happen. The responsible agencies for these horses are the BLM and the Forest Service. They are charged with inventorying these species to determine their proper AMLs. All these efforts are designed to maintain a thriving natural ecological balance and preserve the multiple use relationship on public lands. These agencies are increasingly unable to adequately manage these horses due to difficulties with adoptions, lack of effective fertility control, lawsuits, and of course, holding facilities. These holding facilities, which include feedlots and pastures, are costing the taxpayer over $77 million per year. And that's unacceptable. According to the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906, the Department of Agriculture inspection is mandatory to sell this horse meat to interstate or foreign markets. No inspectors are provided for the horse slaughtering. Neighboring countries have provided facilities to process these horses, but are becoming fewer and fewer. Our northern neighbor just shut down their last plant. This country is in dire need of changes in horse management policies to maintain a healthy horse population, along with protecting the other resources prominent in Wyoming's landscape. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of Representative Winter? Senator Kolb?
Thank you, Acting Mr. Co-Chair. Question, page 7, lines 10 through 13. I was proofreading this thing and I discovered it's kind of a strangely worded sentence. I think I understand what you're trying to get after, but I just wondered what you thought about it. As whereas a pragmatic shift in the United States, which I find I don't understand what that exactly is trying to do. So I guess maybe you could help me out there with the intent or suggestions. Sure. It's page 7, lines 10 through 13, that whereas statement.
So I'll try to explain that if, Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb. This act is combined with the effect of the United States Congress effective ban on equine slaughter facilities. So is that the one you're talking about?
No, I'm not. No, Representative.
Oh, that's page, I'm on 6, I'm sorry.
We're getting close.
Page
7.
7, lines 10 through 13.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, what is it again that, Senator Kolb, what is it that you're concerned about in that?
Well, it's the grammar, whereas a pragmatic shift in United States. I think that's maybe,
Okay, I guess what that means is that we need to do something to change the direction of the management of these horses on federal range. Does that make sense?
yeah, I understand the intent. My issue was just how it was written. I think the grammar's incorrect for what you're trying to intend. I think it could be fixed or stricken, but I certainly, I don't, I'm not an English teacher, but it doesn't read right. Using that kind of word, it's a fragmented sentence, is my point. And I just wondered what you thought about it. I know what the intent is, Representative. I appreciate that. It's just a question of making it, I think, read a little better. And I thought, I guess if you're saying you're good with this, then that's really my question.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I'm good with about anything if we could change some of the wording if it would make it better for you. I'm not sure what you're getting at, I guess, but because I kind of understand what we're talking about here, but if you have some suggestions that would make it better, I'm all for that.
Okay, we can talk about that during the amendment. Thank you, though, for your comment, Representative.
Further comments? Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Winter, I like your bill. I think it's something that we do need to poke the bear on this at the federal level. And, I'm aware of a county north of here that has one of those, off-range holding yards up there. And I know how, I hear from a lot of people how it affects the local hay supply there as well. Trying to feed all those horses, and I think they had some health issues there and had to quarantine a lot of that stuff. But I like this bill. Do you that $77 million that is costing the taxpayers? Not sure where that number came from. And is that nationwide? Is that, maybe all the western states or that are, have that issue with wild horses? And it's that's a big number. And do you know what Wyoming's share of that is, just out of curiosity? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, the figure came from the BLM's report from fiscal year 2021, and it was $77,700,000. And that relates to all the facilities that are around the United States that that pasture or have a feedlot for these excess wild horses that have been captured and processed and shipped to these different locations. So there's, and just another point, we just can't seem to touch the actual population out there on the range. And I don't know what the figure it might be for Wyoming of that, but Wyoming has had, Wyoming was the first state to get involved with gathering horses with the BLM. And so it's been going on ever since I was involved in it, in the 70s.
Any other questions of Representative Winter? Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Winters, can you help me out on page 8, on the section 1 on line 4 through 5, and it says implement best management practices. I've got a lot of guys down in my country, they know what the best management practice is, but I'm just wondering if you would enlighten me as to what you think the federal government's idea of best management practice might be when it comes to the issue for wild horse and burros by allowing for slaughter.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I think it changes from day to day with the BLM, but we have to get these horses off the range. They're doing damage to the range resource, and it doesn't matter, I guess, what people think of where we're at, but the fact is that we need to change some of these best management practices in order to facilitate the proper management of these horses. Does that help you any?
Yeah, I just implement best management practices. I'd hate to leave that to the discretion of the federal government. And I guess the point I'm trying to draw here, the Wild Horse and Burro Act already provides for lethal and euthanasia of excess wild horses. And so I don't know it's the act's the problem. It's the way they do through the appropriations and funds the Department of Interior, and then they put a little rider on there that says none of this money can be used for basically euthanasia of wild horses. So the act actually contemplated that at some point in time we're going to have to euthanize horses, and resolutions are resolutions. But could we just get them to implement the act, I guess is the question.
Well, thank you for that. That would be the right thing to do. As members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association have said, we can send these resolutions to our Congress, and they just kind of stick them in a drawer somewhere, and they're never looked at again. So I'm in the process of getting some action done with some of these surrounding states that also have a problem with these horses. And we're going to have to in my estimation, we just need to inundate the Congress with our problem. And we now have a representative in the Congress who I think will take this and go with it. And so we just have to keep applying pressure to them. And that's what I intend to do. So, but if they would follow the act, they could probably be handled. Thank you.
Further questions? Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick follow-up. Back to Senator sitting next to me here, hit on some of those things that I had circled here too, on page 8, sections 2, 3, there might be some other areas in there where it says State of Wyoming requests the United States Congress to enact legislation. Can we amend that to something more like demands? It's just something strong. I know that doesn't probably matter with US Congress either, but just a little stronger language in there that, we're asking for permission lightly with requests. I think we need to make that a little stronger. That's just a comment. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, thank you for that. I think if we can get this through the legislature, that might be a good idea from here on out, and try to get the governor to sign it, and with that statement in there that we demand of some kind of a demand for of the Congress to do something. So thank you. That it makes sense.
Okay, committee. We've been at this an hour and a half at 6:30. My bad. So is there other questions of Mr. Winter? All right, before we let him go, I think we need to address these points that were brought up. And how do you want to do that?
Mr. Chairman, are you going to take any public comment on the bill?
Yeah, I didn't know if I needed to do that first or straighten the language out.
Mr. Chairman, it's your discretion, but there's other co-sponsors here, so,
Okay.
I need to ask any co-sponsors if they'd like to testify on the bill, and any agencies. I see we have an agency here that would like to start a season for wild horses and arrows.
All right, Mr. Winter, don't go far. We'll have public comment agency. Any agency comment?
Other legislators.
Other legislators? No? Come on up. Come on up.
Mr. Chairman and Board, this is a big issue down in our part of the woods. And one thing that nobody seems to realize is they're a renewable resource. So we should be able to capture them, process them, thus reducing the amount of animals out there so that they do have the proper habitat on. Uh-oh, where'd that come from? Oh, this was, I did call the BLM down there, and in 2020, the last roundup in the area, they captured 1,137 head. Of them 1,137, 728 were removed, 409 were put back out there with the spaying or neutering or whatever, type deal. And that was in 2020. And the last head count here in 2023, there was an estimated 1,600 plus animals out there. And the HMA out there is only built for 700 animals. So once again, as Representative Winters alluded to, it's the habitat out there. There's no developed water. There's nothing for them to eat. So they are currently off the HMA and right in the downtown area of our community over there.
I apologize for interrupting you. I didn't ask you to identify yourselves for the record, so if you would, please.
My apologies. Bob Davis, House District 47. And, whoops. I think if you've got any questions that I could help you with, I would sure,
Any questions for
tougher language would be very good.
Representative Davis? Any questions? Not seeing any. Senator Larson?
Yes, Senator Larson, Senate District 19, I'm on the bill. I think we need to send a message. I don't know what good it'll do, but at least send it again. Keep at it. You know, we went, as Ag Committee, went over and looked at the operation over in Riverton, at the what do we want to call it?
Arner Farm.
Arner Farm. Amazing. You know, if we could get that to be a little bit bigger, but there's no way they can handle more the way they're set up, but it's, we gotta do something. But yeah, any questions, go ahead.
Questions for Senator Larson? Seeing none. Representative?
Mr. Chairman, there is one other thing. We've got an outfit down there that continually makes a living off of just moving these horses from this place to this place. Then they leave them there for a few months and they pick them up and move them to another place. And they're doing quite well, making a living off of hauling the horses around. But anyway,
Any questions? Any more questions? Senator,
Sorry to keep talking here. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Being lawmakers, can we flex our muscle on nullification and just do what our state's 10th Amendment and states' rights say? Or legal from bags, two of them here tonight. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I don't know how to answer that. I would agree with you on a lot of things. That's probably one of them. Go ahead,
Mr. Chair.
Representative.
Representative Hyde, that would be really nice. Pardon? Senator, oh my gosh. Senator Hyde, that would be pretty good, but I don't know if we can do that with federal animals, so unfortunately.
All right. Seeing nothing here, any more questions? So stay close. Any other public comment? Yes, ma'am, please come up.
Mr. Chairman, Senators, my name is Angie Bruce, and I'm a Deputy Director at the Wyoming Game and Fish. And just to clarify, Senator Hicks, we don't want to manage wild horses. They do often have the name wild, but I'll refer to them as feral because I believe they're feral horses on the landscape and should not be confused with our wildlife. But the Game and Fish has become increasingly concerned with the high number of feral horses on the landscape. And so we've been using every opportunity, such as this evening, to discuss that with basically anyone who will listen. And we often are commenting on BLM processes and policies as well. As the Representative Winters talked about the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Barrows Act of 1971, the Secretary of Interior is directed to maintain a thriving natural ecological balance. This is not being accomplished, and therefore there's consequences. The research of unmanaged feral horses shows that feral horses can have a substantial negative impact to wildlife population and rangeland health. Currently, wildlife are competing with wild horses at water sources and for forage. The time for more aggressive feral horse removal is today. We don't want Wyoming to look like what we see in Nevada, in Utah. So removing of additional feral horses from Wyoming's landscape is critical for maintaining our habitat, and I'm especially concerned regarding the impacts to sage grouse and the sage grouse ecosystem. The department continuously supports BLM's feral horse roundups. We most recently assisted our reservation with 2,000 wild horse roundup. Our staff time and equipment was used to assist them. This joint resolution may help to encourage the BLM to consider all tools in the toolbox to continue these horse roundups to a greater degree. So with that, thank you for working on this important issue, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions of Angie?
Yep.
Seeing none?
Thank you.
Stick around. Other public comment? Mr. Moline?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting in support of this resolution. It might not do much good, but it might. And I think we need to keep pushing to get these feral horses under control. We're not asking to completely eliminate them. We're asking to keep them down to the agreements that we made a long time ago, to keep them down to a level where we can have multiple use. I will point out one thing, that if we can get feral horse slaughter, I think there's going to be a positive economic contribution to the rest of the ag industry, because right now old horses are a financial liability. So if we have a market for those, it's going to help out the entire ag industry. But working with these feral horses, getting them down to the levels where they need to be and keeping them down there, the periodic roundups aren't doing a good job of that. So sitting in support of this resolution, and I would take any questions you or the committee may have.
Any questions of Mr. Moline? Seeing none? Thank
Thank
you,
you.
sir. Any other public comment? Mr. McGagnes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Jim McGagnon, Wyoming Stock Growers, Wyoming Wool Growers. And just 2 points I would make. Certainly, we support this resolution. One, assuming that this resolution does pass through the legislature, I would urge that when you send this on to Congress, that you include some real data to back it up. And I'll give you one example. In southwestern Wyoming, the BLM did a major horse gather about a year and a half ago. And at the end of that, they claimed, based on their counts, that they had gotten the horse numbers down to the management level of 2,145 horses over several management areas down there. This past spring, after some pressure was put on them, they did an infrared count of horses in that same area. The 2,145, with obviously some fold increase from 1 year, but turned out to be 4,443. That's a dramatic difference. And I think calling some of that to the attention, not only of Congress, but of the public. Some other recommendation would be that, I'm guilty of the statement that says joint resolutions to Congress go into a black cave back in Washington, D.C. But I think at the same time that the legislature would send that to Congress, that the state needs to give it widespread publicity. The horse groups are out there constantly talking about the poor horses and all the care they need and how lovely they are. And I think we need to counter that as a state with getting out data about what the damage is they're doing to the resources, to the rangeland, to the wildlife, as well as impacting our own industry, and use some of these numbers that are these and other numbers that are certainly available in Wyoming to point out to the public how totally out of hand this has become and what it's costing the taxpayers every year. As Resident Winters indicated, that $77 million is not to manage horses on the range. That is strictly to manage the horses that are currently being held in captivity. And that simply should not be acceptable to the public. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would just urge your support for this resolution.
Thank you. Any questions of Mr. McGagnon? Seeing none? Thank you. Any other public comment? Anybody online? Any other public comment? Going once, going twice. Public comment is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure here? We've, Mr. Winder, you may need to come back up. We had some wording.
Move the resolution.
Second.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, there were several comments on the wording in this resolution. What's your pleasure? Page 7 come up, line 10 through 13. The wording there, we were wondering about, okay, Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. Just a quick thought here. I think this resolution says an awful lot, and of course, I'm for the resolution, but sometimes, short, a little bit shorter might be better. I would be in favor. This is problematic, this statement here, and I don't know if it's really necessary. 9 through 13, to strike it. Just strike 9 through 13, keep everything else, and it will still flow, and it goes on down to 15. So I'd make that motion for an amendment.
So I get this clear. You're saying strike 9 through 13 in its entirety? Is that what
10
you,
through 13.
pardon?
10 through 13.
10 through 13. All right, is that a motion?
Yes.
Second on that?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to strike on page 7, lines 10 through 13. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We're at a standstill here.
No,
I'm a no too. I think it's decent. I don't know what Representative Winter thinks on that, but,
Mr. Chairman, I think that if we come back and just fix the language in there, we can leave that section in there. I just second it for discussion.
Okay, so at this point that has failed. I was looking at that in, after, if, line 10, where it says, whereas a pragmatic shift in United States wild horse, what if we put, whereas a pragmatic shift in the United States, just add the after in? Does that make the sentence flow any better, or is that? Better.
Yep.
Are you, Mr. Winter, what are your thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, you're just saying add the,
Yeah, on line 10, after in, between in and United States, put the, so it would read, whereas a pragmatic shift in the United States wild horse, and blah, blah, blah.
yes, I think that would be fine, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I would move that as an amendment.
Second.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So is there any other wording changes, or I know on page 8, it was brought up, excuse me, lines 4 and 5 in that area. I believe maybe Senator Hicks brought that up. Is that in? What do you want to do there?
It's fine.
Is it fine? So that's good. Any other portions of the resolution that anybody would like to amend? Seeing none? That's how we'll leave it. Thank you, Mr. Winter.
Thank you.
So with that, does this require roll call? Roll call on the bill? Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Kolb. Okay,
Without echoing.
It's a resolution. It's
Joint
not a
resolution.
bill. It's a resolution.
yeah, all right. Roll call for House Joint Resolution number 3.
Senator Hicks,
No.
Senator Ide,
aye.
Senator Kolb,
No.
Senator French.
Aye. So it's a tie. So it dies. It's failed. All right. With that, thank you, everybody.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator
I'm going
Hicks.
to explain my vote. Having sit through wild horse battles for 30 years and stuff, this is not what I feel is the most effective thing that the state of Wyoming can do. In fact, it's been a couple administrations before we ended up in federal court and we had a consent decree that was effective. I don't think sending resolutions back to our congressional delegations that are well aware of the problem is going to make a darn bit of difference in Congress. And if we're really serious about this, we need to get back to what the assistant director talked about, is this documenting the destruction of the thriving ecological balance that's supposed to be maintained as part of the Wild Horse and Burro Act. So this is going to be solved by science and lawsuits. And to a certain degree, I think what Mr. McGagny talked about is also education. And if we're going to be serious about wild horse control and management, then we need to put some time and effort into it, and that includes financial efforts and resources. I would much rather see us spend our time doing that. I think there's a whole host of things that we can and can't do, and we need to work in the arena where we can do and maybe have some impact. So it's not that I appreciate the enthusiasm, because I was there once, but I just don't think this is going to get us down the road. And to that end, Mr. Chairman, what I would like to do is get this on the list of interim topics, because resolutions aren't going to get us anywhere, in my humble opinion. And if we're serious about it, we need to get after it. And that means spend some money and some time and some science and do it, other than just continually send resolutions to Congress. That's the reason I voted no, Mr. Chairman.
Any other comments before we adjourn?
Just one.
Senator Kolb.
I won't have as an eloquent a statement as the good Senator Hicks, but I will do my best. I'll just say that trying the same thing over and over again and it doesn't work is probably something we ought not do anymore. And I will just say that this issue is, we have a infestation in Sweetwater with wild horses. They're thick as thieves, and they bounce back quickly. And I do recognize it to be a very serious problem. And I look forward to doing something different and more substantive that we can make a difference. So just to explain my vote, thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, participation of Representative Winters and Davis, and like I said, I applaud your enthusiasm. I just think if we're going to do this, let's get after it.
Thank you. Any other comments, committee? Seeing none, the Ag Committee, Senate Ag Committee is adjourned.